Good morning, and thanks for joining us here on Treasure Coast Solutions. Wednesday mornings from 9 to 10 o'clock. We talk about some of the things that may impact you from an economic standpoint in the future, and not necessarily financial planning, although certainly having an idea of what potentially is on the horizon from an economic standpoint helps you understand what might be on the horizon for you from a financial standpoint. So, uh, that's kind of the purpose is to discuss some of these issues that maybe don't get a lot of light of the day, don't get discussed, maybe partly because they're boring, uh, and maybe partly because people just don't understand them, partly because I think some of the people in the profession make it harder than it really is to justify a position they want to support that really doesn't have support. And that's true. I think, it's funny. It's true in a lot of different professions. Uh, my name is Mark Breckbill. I'm a CPA for those of you that are new to the show. And I'm an ex banker as well. So we all use acronyms, and it shows how in touch with our profession we are if we know all of these acronyms and others don't. So it's really kind of, a secret language that we have that only the really intelligent people within the profession understand. So, and I think that's what happens sometimes. It's kind of the same thing in economics. Is sometimes people throw out terms and those terms are not always fully understood, or they have a different explanation or a different definition in other areas, and so some people think of it the same. I'll give you an example, is that the definition of income in of net income, not gross income, but the definition of net income, and also in many cases the definition of gross income in the economic world is completely different than the definition of income in in the accounting world. Uh, the definition of taxes and tax is different in the economic world than it is in the accounting world. So when somebody talks about increasing your taxes, for example, uh, if a politician is discussing that, your assumption is that they're talking about the accounting definition of taxes and the tax uh, IRS definition of taxes. Yet they may be they may be um, dealing in or talking about things that are affect the economic definition of taxes. So I just want to throw some of that. So there's some different meanings. And so what do I mean by taxes? Well, like we've talked about before, from an economic standpoint, taxes are not something that's levied on net profit. Most of us think of taxes as, okay, we have income that comes in, we have our business expenses, and then we have net profit. And then taxes are what we pay on the net profit. And if we're a small business that's treated as a partnership for tax or a S corp for tax or something like that, not only is that are those taxes paid on net income, they're actually paid on our personal return, not on our business return. So if I say, if I make the comment that I'm just going to tax business income because businesses aren't paying their fair share, well, you'd have to understand then that uh, that is a tax that would be applied to everyone, but individuals don't they pay tax from the business standpoint. The business typically doesn't because the business either is a pass through, and so the taxes are going to fall on the individual to pay the tax, uh, not on the business itself. And uh, so what basically happens is that taxes at the corporate level, if you have a corporation, um, they pay tax twice. Actually, they pay tax. You pay tax when the company makes the money, and then you pay tax again when the money's distributed to the owners. And that is referred to, that's the double taxation that small business tries to avoid by being an S corp or an LLC taxed as a partnership. They want to avoid that double taxation. So to do that, they make an election which allows that income to be taxed to them, even though it's earned by the business. Um, the problem that you've got is that the they're actually having to pay those taxes um, on uh, using cash flow from the business that may not be there. In other words, there may not be the cash flow to pay those taxes because those taxes may not be factored in at that level. They may flow through and not be factored in. They're not factored in. How many business owners do you know that change their prices every time they do their tax return? Technically, they should. I mean, every time you do your tax return individually, if you've got a pass-through entity and you have to pay taxes, you should go back and make sure that those taxes are included in your income, that you've raised the price or are getting a large enough price to cover all of your costs, plus generate enough a profit to pay your taxes, and make sure you've generated enough profit in cash, not just enough profit, but not enough profit in cash. So what do I mean by that? Well, if I can generate a profit in my business, but to do that, I have to maintain and pay certain things out of pocket or with my business's money in advance. So for me to sell a a widget, for me to sell a widget, and if I'm going to sell that widget, it's made up of some inventory, and I've got to pay people to put the inventory together to make the widget. And so all of those things, the labor that I'm paying to put the widget together, the actual materials that I'm using for that widget, all of those things I have to pay um, uh, before I sell the widget, because I got to make the widget. So don't buy most people don't buy a widget in advance. People don't put their money in advance. Like, for example, a lot of people are having problems right now with cars because if you want to buy certain new cars, you have to go. It's a 1 year order for that car. Well, the manufacturers want you to put money down. They want you to have real money down. They actually like you to pay for it in some cases. Well, try to go to the bank and get a loan on a car that isn't been delivered yet, and in fact won't be produced for 12 months. You can't do that, right? So in most cases, you can't do that. So what happens is that you've got to have the cash flow up front to do that. You have to own that inventory, and what's happened with many businesses today, this is why we have what they call a supply chain problem, is that businesses have for the last 20 years um, been functioning under what's called JIT, just in time inventory. It's just in time inventory um, is where you come in, you buy the product, and I deliver it to you that day or the next day, but I don't own it at the time that I sell it. I only own it for a day. I buy it from my factory, and I let the factory know, okay, I've got this sale. I need you to deliver a vehicle now. I need you to deliver a widget now, and then it's there within a very short period of time. So all I have to do is maintain a couple days worth of sales. So the goal is to do that, and in fact, to be a little back ordered if you need to, just so you can't be too back ordered because you don't want to lose the sale. But if it's a specialty item that's relatively expensive, you might not order that from the factory to resell until you actually have a customer that's going to buy it. The car situation, it's you don't want to produce uh, a pink Tesla if there's no market for pink Teslas. So you don't know if there's a market for a pink Tesla until somebody comes in and says, I'm putting down, $80,000. I want you to deliver me a pink Tesla. So you don't have an inventory of pink Teslas. You're going to buy that when it's ordered. It's a custom order. It's an expensive order. So those are the type of things which are really just in time or after just in time. When they talk about the supply chain problems, what you're talking about is not the business itself. It has the sale, but it doesn't have the inventory because it doesn't have a supply of inventory. Businesses don't maintain those levels of inventory anymore. What's happening is businesses are trying to move back to supply inventory because they have work out there. So they're kind of anticipating that and are not worried as much about having excess inventory because they understand that it's taking a while to produce the inventory and they know they're going to have the sales. You can't finance that though. Where do they get the money to pay for that? Because inventory has to be paid in advance. So you haven't sold the item yet, unless it's something that's really large and you get a deposit. But for the average thing, when you go into the hardware store, let's say you go into Peter's Hardware and you're looking for, a certain kind of hammer in Peter's. Well, he would, you might choose from 3 or 4. And so in the past, he might have maintained 3, 4, 5 different hammers, and he might have a couple, 2, 3 of them because he knows when he gets down to 1, he can order that hammer and get it in within a day and resupply and be back up to 2 or 3. So he's got a stock. So unless he has a run on that particular hammer in that particular day, he's not going to be out of that. And he can order it the next day and it'll be delivered that day. That was just-in-time inventory. Now, what Peter would like to do, would probably want to do right now, because he knows he can probably sell a lot of hammers. He just doesn't know which ones that he's going to be able to sell. He would like to maybe keep 5 of each kind of hammers on sale, on supply right now, or maybe 10, so that he doesn't have to order as frequently, doesn't have to worry about a backlog. He knows he's got it. So he goes out. Well, it may be that 2 of those hammers are produced in China and they're not producing them right now. So he can't get those. But even if he could get them, let's say he could order all of those, he's got to finance it. So if his inventory of hammers used to be $200, and now he's got 3 times the inventory, it's $600. Well, that's an additional $400 that he has to put out in advance of ever getting a sale. And that costs him money. That costs him financing money, because he either has to have money out of his bank account, which means he doesn't have money to spend on something else. He may have to borrow on a line of credit to fund the inventory. So that means he's paying an interest cost. It may mean that he's just taking home less pay or paying his taxes and having to pay his taxes in advance. And that's costing him money, because it's money that he needed to fix his house up or do something at his home, and he doesn't have the cash flow. So all of that is what's happening in the market today. And that's why we have a problem. The demand is definitely there. And we saw that because we had big numbers at one point. As soon as the economy, as soon as we had less restrictions on the economy, immediately there was pent-up demand for a lot of things, and people needed it. But there still was no inventory, and the just-in-time concept isn't working. It wasn't working. It doesn't work. So it's just the opposite. And it's now a situation where large parts of your product are being tied up, large product parts of your sale are being tied up because you can't get the inventory for one very small piece. So let me give you an example. Um, I'm moving this historic building, and it should have taken it should have taken 30 days or so to move the building, and it should have taken about 90 days to get it ready to go so that it could open. Instead, it's been months. And why is that? Is it because people are incompetent and don't know what they're doing? No. In fact, my contractor, John Erickson, he's on top of all of this stuff from an advanced standpoint. But here's the issue that he can't that there's nothing he can do about it, is that to do this, we had to put in a foundation, we had to move the building, and we had to put the foundation in so the building could be put on the foundation, and then you got to fill dirt in, right? But you also have to put in, because it's going to be a restaurant, you have to put in a grease trap, you have to hook up electric, you have to hook up water and sewer. All of that stuff has to be done before you fill it all in, and before you put it re-asphalt it, right? So, and furthermore, because the grease trap has to be put in below some of this other stuff, the grease trap has to go first. So you can't do any of the other work until the grease trap is in, because all of the pipes that will connect the rest of the stuff would be exposed. They'll be up in the air instead of being laying in dirt where they're supposed to be, or underground where they're supposed to be. So they'd all be sticking up and sticking out, and they break, and so you can't do it. So I needed to do a grease trap. Grease trap, normally probably because of the cost of a grease trap, a plumber is not going to keep 5 grease traps in stock or 7 grease traps in stock. Normally, if they don't have a grease trap in stock, they order it, and it takes 4 to 6 weeks, maybe max. Maybe they could even actually get it in a week or less in the old days, pre-COVID. But during the COVID time, you're probably talking about taking 4 to 6 weeks. Took 6 months. Took 6 months to get that in. Nothing else can be done, so everything's backed up for a relatively minor portion of the cost. Not the plumber's fault, but at the same time, I can guarantee you, when the economy changes, business is not designed profitability-wise to work with huge levels of inventory. Their profits are all based on them being able to turn over inventory quickly and not having to have huge lines of credit to maintain that inventory. That is going to change, and it's going to be a problem for business because they're not going to be able to finance it. Maybe some of the big businesses will, some of the publicly traded businesses will, but the small business isn't going to be able to go out there and borrow $1.5 million to put into inventory that's not going to increase their sales at all. All it's going to do is increase their costs. But that's what's going to have to happen, because that market is changing because of these supply chain shortages that exist. But it's not even that. It's even if it's just we're not producing at the same levels. And even if we were producing at the same levels, business can't afford to carry those levels of inventory without doing what? Increasing their price. So that's going to create inflation. Where does that inflation come from? Well, it comes from maintaining high levels of inventory, but those high levels of inventory have to be financed. So it generally comes from the financial markets. It comes from the financing side. So the higher those interest rates are, the more that costs, and the more that the business owner needs to increase their prices. When a publicly traded company that's a corporation, when that publicly traded C corporation pays taxes, first of all, they pay it out of the company's money, not out of the individual's money. So they don't have to pay that second tax. They don't have to pay. They have the cash, so they're not paying that ultimate tax based on profits. They are, and they do have some of those costs, but they have, most of them have the ability to factor some of that cost in, and they raise prices. So when you raise taxes on a corporation, all you do is raise prices. I mean, ultimately, that's always what's going to happen. Um, if you have a business that's a monopoly or an oligopoly, they can actually increase their prices more than taxes and make a profit on the taxes. They can, they can generate a higher return because they can pass through a higher price. They already may be passing through a higher price, something other than the fair price. And a fair is an economic term, not a accounting or or a regular everyday term. Usually you and I think fair price. We think of a price that is that is oh, something I want to pay. Oh, that's not a bad price. That's pretty good. I like that. That price is okay. That's fair. I would pay that. You know, that's what we think of as a fair price. In in economics, a fair price is not that. A fair price is um, what a willing buyer and a willing seller, all with equal strength. So usually it's buyers and sellers, large group of buyers, large group of sellers, none of which are, large, substantially larger than the others. None are substantially more powerful than the others. And so therefore, the price that we negotiate is not necessarily a price that I would say, oh, I'd pay that for that. That's a fair price. No, it's the price at which, it's called the equilibrium price. It's the price at which the seller is willing to sell based on what they need to do to make, to cover their costs and their profit and their return onto their investors, and what the buyer needs to pay to be able to utilize the product and make a profit from it. So, and that, in a free enterprise system, it's called an equilibrium price, and it happens automatically because if you don't buy it at that price, somebody else will. And if I don't sell it at that price, somebody else will. So if my price is higher on the seller and my high price is higher than equilibrium, I get stuck with my product. I'm not going to sell my product. It's not that I'm going to sell less of my product. What's going to actually happen is I'm going to sell zero of my product. So I'm going to go from selling a normal amount based on that price to selling zero. And if I'm a buyer and I'm not willing to pay that equilibrium seller price, then I will never be able to buy. And that's a problem. In the real estate market, for example, most people would think that housing prices right now are too high. And if you talk to anybody and said, well, we don't have, that price is not a fair price. Well, you can say that because you don't think it's a price that you'd want to pay. You think it's overpriced. You think the market's a bubble or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, there are large groups of buyers out there still who want to pay that price. So now part of that is because we don't have a big inventory of those. So there are not a lot of sellers. So what you've got is you've got a large number of buyers and a small number of sellers than typical. And so what's happening is the sellers are getting higher than a higher price generally than they should. A higher price than fair price. Not than they should, but than fair price. Well, you look at that and you say, well, part of that really is because the sellers don't want to be buyers. they don't want to sell to turn out to be buyers. So there is a shortage, and that shortage is causing some equilibrium issues. So right now, because we have less sellers, substantially less sellers than buyers, um, that market is not producing an equilibrium price. And so when you look at that, you say, "Oh, that's," but it's not because the buyer doesn't want to pay the price. The buyer's willing to pay the price. The problem is there's no sellers out there. So, um, and so as a result, uh, it's created a situation where cash buyers have, some clout. Um, they are maybe getting a better price than the and they may be getting the equilibrium price because they can guarantee that they're going to close and they can do it quickly. And there may be 3 or 4 people that have got cash because they've sold their house and or they've, borrowed money against their house up north or whatever. So bottom line is, that's what's happening in a normal real estate market. You can complain about prices, but normally we have a fairly, even in a small place like Martin County, we have a fairly large number of buyers and a fairly large number of sellers at any point in time, at least large enough compared to our market to produce a reasonable price, a fair price. Now, I would argue, since we were talking about real estate, I would argue that, people are saying, well, we don't have, the prices are overstated. And like I said, that's usually from a buyer's perspective. No seller ever complains about the price being too high. How often do you hear somebody say, yeah, I sold my house for $500,000. Man, that was way more than it should have been. I'm going to go back and change that. That's way too high. I'm going to only sell it for 250,000. Because 500 is way too high. No, sellers never complain. On the other hand, buyers complain all the time. Geez, I paid $500,000 for that house, and just 3 years ago, it sold for 250. I'm not paying more than 250 because it sold for 250 2 years ago, and that person shouldn't make that kind of money. Well, sorry, that's not what the price is today. That's what the price was, and that those days are over. So what I'm getting at is the equilibrium, the price issue is as a result of sellers not having inventory. Not necessarily that buyers aren't willing to pay the price. They are. When there is inventory, that's what's forcing the price up. We got buyers that are paying the price. So the question, though, is that may not be the fair price because there's not a large enough number of sellers to get what would be considered an equilibrium price. But that doesn't mean that economically it's not still a good price. So that's what I'm saying. There's a difference between equilibrium price, referred to as equilibrium price or fair price, and an economically a good price. In other words, a price that you can still make money. And you still, and it still justifies it. And here's what I'm getting at in the real estate market. If I'm buying a home right now that is a 2-bedroom, 2-bath condo, and those things in certain, around the community, you could find a 2-bedroom, 2-bath condo for probably 80 or 90,000 in some places, particularly some 55 and over communities. And they're selling now for as much as 160, 150, 160, maybe 200. And people are saying, wow, they bought that for $60,000, 8 years ago, and now they're selling it for $160,000. That's crazy, right? And that price must be wrong. That must be too high of a price. But back 6 years ago or 8 years ago, whenever I said that you could bought it for $60,000, if you were going to rent that condo out, you could rent it only for probably $800 a month, maybe somewhere in that range, $750, $800 a month, maybe even a little less. Now you can rent it for $1,600, $1,700 a month. So your income off of that property, if you were going to lease it, is substantially higher. And so from that standpoint, if I look at it from an income approach, which appraisers do on the commercial side, but don't do on the residential side, if I look at it from an income approach, I'm still making a 6 or 7% return on my money. And in this interest rate environment, a 6 or 7% return is adequate. It's a decent return. So um, so for me, that's a good deal. I'll pay 170 or $180,000 because I know I can make money on it at that level, and I can make enough money that I can beat inflation. I can make a 7 or 8% return. Now, what you have to take into consideration is how much higher can that rent go? So if inflation goes up, am I going to be able to bump that rate up so that I can get a 9 or 10% return? I don't know. Right now, with where the economy is and where inflation is, if it goes up, you get this stagflation concept again, and you get this situation where you can't push the rent up because wages may go down. Uh, but if wages go up, or if people decide to start buying and owning again, so there's not as much rental out there. It just depends. But if right now in this market, I think we're approaching an a point where the market's overpriced because the rental rate right now is high enough that it's producing a reasonable return, still producing about an 8% return. And but if inflation goes up to 10%, I don't want an 8% return on a rental property. I'd rather have a 10% return on a U.S. Treasury bond, which is guaranteed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government rather than being guaranteed by somebody who's a local CPA, somebody like me. I'd rather have it guaranteed by the government and have 10% than have it guaranteed by me and have 8%. And furthermore, you may not be able to get me out because you may not be able to evict me. The government's going to pay you no matter what. So, so I think we're getting close. And it bothers me, for example, that normally when we get close, the market takes care of this. So it's going to be a situation where all of a sudden there won't be as many buyers. And frankly, probably the number of sellers would stay about the same. And so, prices are going to come down a little bit. And, we've got this arbitrary shortage in housing from a purchase standpoint. So it's supply side. So what's going to happen if all of a sudden the supply goes up? And furthermore, what if if all of a sudden 1,000 condominiums, 2-bedroom condominiums came on the market in Martin County, what would happen to the price of 2-bedroom condominiums? It would go down, right? Because now we would have way, way more sellers than we have buyers. And when we have more sellers than buyers, they have to reduce their price to get the buyers to step in. Now, I was saying, okay, right now I don't mind being a buyer because I can get $1,650 for rent. And so I'm saying, well, maybe that's not a problem because if I'm an investor and I'm buying, maybe I'll still pay this price because I can get $1,650. But what if all of those 1,000 units are coming on as rentals? You say, well, then they're not selling it. So how does that affect the market? Well, that affects the buyer side of the market because if now there are 1,000 rental units out there and those rental units no longer can get $1,650 because there's 1,000 more of them and there was only 1,000 to start with. So now all of a sudden I have 2,000 apartments out there to rent and I've only got, 200 people that are looking to rent and I've got 2,000 units. what am I going to have to do to get those units rented in any kind of short-term period of time? Next year, let's say, for example. Let's say I want to be full. I want all those 1,000 units full in another year, by a year. Well, if all that's out there are 200 buyers, let's say 200 buyers a year, or like we have here, maybe 10 units a month in Stuart, maybe the absorption rate is 10 units a month. If I can't increase the number of people coming in to buy, then those units, if I have 1,000 of them, it's going to take 100 years for me at 10 units a month. It's going to take a long time for me to get those units out there, right? So, it's going to, and so from that standpoint, how am I going to get it done faster? I have to reduce price. So that is going to, first of all, affect my project. Most likely, my price isn't going to go down. Why is that? Because I couldn't build it in the first place. So that's one of the fallacies that's out there in the market right now by government, especially the government here in Stuart, the city government, is that if we build them, they will come. There's a concept that there's 20,000 jobs in downtown in the city of Stuart, and 17,000 of those people live outside the city. So therefore, there's this unmet demand where there's 17,000 people that would immediately want to move into Stuart. Well, that's probably not necessarily true. And so, you can back that down right away. But the fact of the matter is, if even if there are some out there, they're probably subject to a lease. How many of them have their lease expiring today or in the next 30 days? Some of them may have just entered into a lease. So, so even if 10%, that's 1,700 are in a position they can move, but that's assuming everybody is going to move, and it's not going to happen. But more importantly, here's what's going to happen. If those units were vacant, it would force down price. But one of the things that has to be done to build those units is that the developer has to get investors. They have to get investors. They have to get people to finance. They have to have bankers and investors. Before a banker or an investor puts up money, what's the first thing that they want to know? What's my return going to be? How much interest are you going to be able to pay me? How much return are you going to be able to pay me on my investment? And over what period of time? And when does that return start? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at what you're proposing and all of the costs. You've put together great plans. You've got, you may even have it. You've got it approved. We know exactly what we can build there. We're not concerned that we might not get it approved. We know exactly what we're going to build there, but we're going to build 1,000 apartments. So the first thing I'm going to look at is, can I get rid of 1,000 apartments? Are you going to be able, how long is it going to take you to lease 1,000 apartments? Well, what I'm going to look at if I'm an investor or a banker is not potentially what you think is going to happen. I don't care that there are 17,000 people that could move into the city of Stuart. I don't care how many of those currently have leases expiring. I don't care about any of that. All I care about is what has historically happened. How many people historically are looking for apartments in Stuart right now, today? And the answer is 10. 10 a month is what the normal absorption rate has been for Stuart. 10 units a month. I've got 1,000. Now you're saying, well, I don't have 1,000. I only have 200. Maybe somebody else has got 200. Somebody else has got 200. So that's the difference. I've only got 200. Well, you might get somebody that's an investor in real estate or a lender that is stupid enough, not likely, but is stupid enough to just look at your project and say, okay, the absorption rate in Stuart is 10 units a month, and you're going to get, you've got 200 units. So, we've got 20 months that you're going to get yours, you're going to get your units sold in. So, okay, we'll factor that in. And yeah, and they're going to ignore the fact that there's another 800 or so units a month that or 100 units, 800 units that are out there that are already for or going to be for sale, maybe before your project, and they're not going to get any. Well, they're not that stupid. Investors, if anything, and bankers in particular, don't lend money if they think there's a chance that that's going to happen. And so what's going to happen with all these projects is the ones that have already come online are going to immediately create a glut, and they're going to be vacant. They're not going to be filled as quickly. And so what's going to happen is that those investors or those projects are going to cause the other projects not to come out of the ground, or if they've come out of the ground, not to get finished. And the reason is that the banks are going to pull the funding. Here's the other problem. Most of these loans, most of these projects are not funded long term when they're originally done. They are because if they're not completely leased, the developer isn't going to get maximum money for that project. They're not going to get their money out of it, and what they could, because it's not producing a high enough income. So let's say, for example, that I've got a 10%. Let's say I've got a 10% cap rate, a 10% return that I'm going to get on my project when it's full and occupied. But let's say that I've only got it 40% occupied. Well, at that point, my return may only be 4%, not 10%. So if I go to sell this apartment building, the value of that apartment building is going to be based on the income approach. That income approach is going to take into consideration your vacancy rate and and what's going on with that vacancy rate. So at that point, that building is going to be worth substantially less than what it would be if it was even 90% occupied. And so if I'm the owner of that building, am I going to put it on the market when it's 90%? I mean, when it's 40% occupied, or when it's 90% occupied? When it's 90%. So what's happening right now is we've got a lot of building going on because the money for those projects had already been put up based on what was out there at the time and the return that they thought they could get once it was occupied and how long they thought it was going to take to get occupied. What's going to happen, and it's already happened to some degree with existing projects, is that once the project has been open for 2 or 3 years and it's had a chance to lease up, these people are going out, these developers are going out to try to sell that building and get their money back for their investors, or refinance that property and pull some cash out for their investors. And what's happening is that the property isn't leased up, and even after 2 or 3 years, and so their return isn't as high as they thought it would be, and either they can't borrow the money, they can't borrow the amount of money or at the interest rate they want, or they can't sell the property at the price they want to another investor. Even if interest rates have gone down. It used to be that investors wanted an 8%, maybe even a 10% cap rate on a project like that. And now, they're down to 5.5, 6.5. But still, even with that going down, if I'm not occupied enough to produce even that level of cap rate, I'm not going to sell my building and it's not going to appraise out. When that happens, all of these projects will grind to a halt because investors find out and they hear what's going on, and all of this stuff kind of stops. So that's what's going to happen with those projects. And that's what the government doesn't think about. And they should, because it's just logic. It's basic economics. This is what happens. It's basic supply and demand. When you approve that many units, this is what's going to fall out. And it doesn't happen directly sometimes. So that's like I say, you get people that give advice based on the interim stuff, and they say, well, we're still going to get this done, or it doesn't. It eventually happen. It drips through the system. It falls through the system, and it happens, and then it causes a great disruption. But it does not happen what they think is going to happen, and what they think is going to happen is you'll have a lot of vacant units, so rental rates will go down. That will not, because those projects will go bankrupt. Their investors will foreclose on them. Their lenders will foreclose on them, and they will be bankrupt projects. And nobody wants a city with a bunch of unbuilt projects or partially built projects. We had that back in the day, in 2008, 2009. We saw what happened. So we don't want it. We don't want that again. So I guess, I'm kind of running out of time, but I'll mention just one other thing is I want to talk. Last thing I want to talk about a little bit is an irritation. It's an economic irritation, but it's also a political irritation. Business, as it relates to a free enterprise system, government, I should say, as it relates to a free enterprise system, has no business competing with business, particularly local business. It is harder. It's hard enough for them to make money. They bear a higher cost of taxes and everything else. It does not make sense for a government to force up their taxes and force up taxes so that the government can run private businesses. And what I'm talking about are golf courses, restaurants, water parks, campgrounds. All of those things are not the purview of a governmental entity. Buying property and flipping it for a profit, that is not what we pay our government to do. Okay? They provide infrastructure. They provide parks. They do not provide parks that make a profit. That's not their job, because they're using our money and forcing out private enterprise who would bring more money to the economy in the long run. And that will never happen. So I just want to throw that out there. All of this stuff may look nice, but think of it this way. Every single time that you go to that beachfront cafe or that local golf course that's owned by the government, you are taking money away from some person that in the community. You are taking away money from people that could go back into the community and shouldn't be done. So just remember that as you're looking out over that nice ocean views that nobody else was allowed to participate in. Anyway, that's it for me today. We'll talk a little bit more next Wednesday, every Wednesday from 9 to 10 o'clock right here on WSTU Digital 1450. We are Martin County's Heritage Station.